All right. So my name is McPherrin. I am a site reliability engineer at Let's Encrypt, one of the world's biggest certification authorities. Today I'm going to talk about web PKI revocation, that it's broken, what that means for it to be broken, and what it is in the first place, and how we are going to fix it. So first, what do I mean when I say the web public key infrastructure? Because that's kind of a vague term. Really, I'm talking about the certificates that you're using when a browser is talking to a website over HTTPS to know that it's talking to the right website. Specifically, we're going to focus on the use case of the public internet using public DNS, public IP addresses with broadly trusted certificate authorities. That's ignoring a lot of the use cases of the same technology that's used for, say, intranets and corporations, or related X509 use cases in like email, SMIME, or all kinds of other stuff, code signing, document signing. So we're focusing specifically on, the web, basically. When you connect to an HTTPS website, you have a certificate that is used to cryptographically bind the domain name that you're connecting to the website operator's public key. That certificate has been signed using a cryptographic signature by a certification authority, usually either the RSA or ECDSA algorithms, though that'll hopefully be something post-quantum secure in the near future. The web browser is in charge of checking the domain name on that certificate matches what it intended to connect to. It checks that the public key in the certificate has signed the TLS handshake properly. And it checks that the certificate is signed by a trusted certification authority. That gets you basically the property that you are sure you're connecting to the right website as attested by these series of signatures. There's a bunch of different players in this ecosystem. You've got a browser user, which is almost everyone in the world. You've got the web browser that they installed from a browser vendor, Safari, Chrome, Edge, or Firefox. That browser is being used by the user to connect to a website run by some website operator. The website operator gets their certificate from a certification authority like Let's Encrypt, and the browser vendors are in charge of picking who is trusted by their browser as a CA, unless the EU gets their way, in which case the EU will be in charge of it instead. But things can go wrong. Maybe you sold your domain name to someone else. Maybe your site got hacked. Maybe there's some major OpenSSL vuln that leaked all your keys. Basically, there's some reason that we don't actually want to trust that certificate anymore. So in that case, we need to revoke. Certificates have an expiry date, usually up to a year. And so there's this timeline that we don't have to worry about it after a year, but before then, we have various solutions to basically push that untrusted date earlier. The certificate authority is the one who's in charge of tracking that status. There's various circumstances under which CAs are required to revoke certificates. For example, if the keys are leaked, if the person who holds the domain registers it, or potentially other use cases like if the CA misissued it in the first place, they might be forced to revoke it. That can actually lead to a situation we sort of call mass revocation, where maybe there was a bug in the CA software or their processes that led to a whole bunch of certificates being issued potentially improperly. And potentially is all you need for policy failures like that, where we can't have utmost confidence that was issued properly. So one of the big challenges in revocation that we're not really going to get into is mass revocation, where you might have to revoke a whole lot of them. Really, the central problem here is that we've added a new arrow to our diagram. And because this is sort of an exceptional case where the browser user has to check with the CA to find out, is the certificate revoked, we've got this path that is not really well exercised and has a bunch of technical and privacy restrictions, and is really what has led to all of the heartburn today, where things aren't really working. We have a big collection of options that we're going to go through in this talk and sort of talk about how we got from one to the next, why we thought they might work, why they didn't end up working, and where we're going to go. In the very beginning, we had certificate revocation lists. This is a pretty simple file format that you download, or your browser downloads on your behalf. It contains basically a list of serial numbers for some issuer, and it's signed and has an expiry date of the CRL itself. The certificates have an HTTP URL in them that points to where you can find the CRL. It's called a CRL distribution point. And they sort of hundreds to kilobytes up to megabytes if maybe you've had the mass revocation and have revoked a whole lot of them. The format is actually very similar to a certificate, sort of just with different fields in it. It's actually defined in the same RFC and uses the same ASL1 kind of encoding as certificates. They've been around for, basically the whole time, but they don't really work. Because it's hundreds of kilobytes and we need to check revocation at the start of a TLS connection, it's just way too slow to download them on the fly unless you're really willing to, wait 30 seconds for your website to load, which nobody wants. Because there are hundreds of megabytes potentially for a complete set, you can't store all of them, certainly not at the web PKI scale. Or certainly you couldn't in the 90s when we sort of designed these things. Most of the CRL isn't going to be interesting to the client because it's going to have a list of all of the serials on the internet that are revoked, and most people aren't going to all of the websites on the internet. And sort of as a result of this, most web browsers don't use CRLs today. There are some mitigations to the big size problems, like having a bunch of different CRLs that we call sharded CRLs to make them smaller and sort of reduce what you have to download, but ultimately it's not widely deployed in the public PKI. The CRLs are widely used in sort of enterprise use cases where you have one enterprise CA. You might have most of your sites controlled by that, and you can push it out to everyone's managed desktop easily, but doesn't really work at web PKI scale. We've known this for a long time. So around the year 2000, the sort of second obvious design choice is just ask the CA if each cert is revoked, which was built as the online certificate status protocol. It's a simple RPC protocol. Again, there's a URL that's in the certificate, and you just call the URL and say, hey, is this certificate revoked? The request is signed by the CA, again, kind of like a cert. And that kind of gives you confidence that the CA gave you valid things. OCSP responses are valid for about a week, and you can cache them if you want. But it didn't really work out. The biggest problem is that this is a service that the CA has to run that has to effectively have 100% uptime if every browser everywhere in the world is continually asking if certs are revoked. Because nobody can run 100% uptime certificates, especially someone like a CA, who this is really the only thing that they have any uptime requirements on, is probably not going to have a good time. And so the browsers basically all fail open if they can't reach OCSP. That means that a network attacker can just block OCSP, which is the type of attacker that TLS is trying to defend against, which basically means that OCSP doesn't work. The attacker, while they're man in the middling the TLS connection, just blocks OCSP checks, and it'll continue to work. Or if they have a cached OCSP entry from when it was good, they still get to man in the middle for a week until that expires. In addition, OCSP has really bad privacy policies. Every time you connect to a website, or maybe you have a cache, the first time you connect to a website in a week, you are leaking essentially across the internet to anyone who's interested what domain you're connecting to, or at least what cert you're connecting to. That leaks it to both the CA, who could potentially log this in their OCSP servers. That would provide some great metadata. Or if you were sort of a nation state actor, or sort of otherwise a global threat actor with privileged network perspectives, you could really have a big amount of visibility into what people are viewing just from that OCSP server. So Because of these really bad privacy problems, Chrome has completely dropped OCSP. Other browsers do OCSP checks today, the Microsoft, Firefox, Apple ecosystems. And it's sort of uncommon to do OCSP checks outside of the browsers. There's plenty of other things like APIs and client libraries that might connect to websites, but they usually don't do OCSP. Some firewalls and that kind of thing will do both OCSP checks and CRLs. This was sort of an obvious design problem from the very beginning. People didn't miss this. They sort of knew it was going to happen. So we designed another mechanism, which is called OCSP stapling. So in the version of OCSP I just described, the web browser goes and asks the CA for the OCSP response, which leads to our sort of privacy and uptime problems. But there's an alternate way of doing this. Because those requests are signed, they don't actually have to be distributed directly from the CA. They can be distributed by the website. So that's called stapling. The web server, maybe once a day or so, will go ask the CA for the OCSP response, download it, save it on its server, hard drive, or whatever, probably next to the certificate, and then it can include that stapled in the TLS handshake along with the certificate. So great, it's fixed. There's no more privacy problem. There's no more uptime problem. Everything's fixed. Unfortunately, everything's not fixed. The problem is that the server needs to do this step where it has to fetch and staple the OCSP response. You do need some availability of the CA OCSP server to do that, at least once a week or so. But the web server isn't going to know when the CA's website is available. And it's sort of complex code to make this happen. The major web servers like Apache and Nginx have notably really bad implementations of this. Apache, for example, would just sort of give up if it couldn't fetch an OCSP response and then might not retry stapling later. I think Nginx had a bug for a long time where they would staple any OCSP response, even if the response was revoked. And stapling a response telling you that, oh, actually, my cert's revoked is not helpful. And there's sort of there's nothing that has forced people to actually implement this. So a lot of web servers just straight up don't support OCSP stapling. And that sort of led to the death spiral of non-adoption. There is a flag that CAs can set on certs, which says that you must staple a response. CAs don't want to do that because it would break any websites that aren't stapling. Browsers can't require OCSP stapling because lots of websites don't staple. The server software doesn't really care about implementing it well because of the previous two statements where nobody really wants it. So we're sort of stuck in this loop of non-adoption where sort of everybody maybe agrees that this is a good solution, but there's just too many problems with implementing it. And I think at this point, most of sort of the industry has sort of given up on OCSP stapling. It's just too hard to deploy. Generally, any change like this where you need to actually go change every single web server in the world is not really practical. Unlike browsers, which is a very small number and they auto-update, it's really not true with web servers. People running 10-year-old copies of Apache on some ancient CentOS distribution is still a widespread thing that people have. So the browsers are trying to fix this sort of without the cooperation of the site owners. Chrome has a thing they call CRL sets. Mozilla has the same thing. They call it one CRL. That support an out-of-band revocation mechanism. The browser vendor is using the same CRL format, but they're pushing it to their browsers directly. As I mentioned at the start, CRLs are too big to push the complete set. So the browser vendors themselves are sort of doing this calculus about what is a high-value revocation and what do they push out. So an intermediate CA or even a root CA that's done something bad might get revoked. If you're a high-profile website and you're getting news coverage about how people are man-in-the-middling you, then yeah, maybe that'll get pushed out. So it's an incomplete solution, but it's easy to do, and it has been done. So this is sort of, the fire alarm of the internet, but it's not really scalable. However, there was this 2017 paper called CRL Lite, a scalable system for pushing all TLS revocations to all browsers, which is a scalable system for pushing all TLS revocations to all browsers. It uses a push-based model similar to the previous CRL sets and CRL Lite to push certs to all the browsers, but it makes some really interesting compression choices. So one of the things that has happened in the last decade is a system called certificate transparency, where all certs are logged to globally publicly accessible logs. As well, all of the CRLs are public. So combining those two facts together has led people to develop this innovative compression technique to compress the Bloom filters in a very compact way that's less than 1 byte per revocation, much smaller than CRLs. And this actually allows browsers to push all revocations to all browsers relatively quickly. CRLs weren't actually required to be issued by CAs. OCSP was mandatory, but Mozilla added the requirement to enable this. Firefox is beginning to roll out CRL Lite. Other browsers have sort of vaguely indicated interest. Apple has also added a requirement for CRLs. They're a fortress of silence, so we don't know why, but we could assume that they're doing something similar. And Chrome have publicly indicated in talks that they might be doing something like this soon too. One of the final problems is that, this is still pretty big, but we have this like built-in mechanism with expiry of certificates. And rather than a sort of complex mechanism of OCSP pinning or these compressed sets that need to be powered by a browser vendor, we could just make certificate lifetime shorter. OCSP and CRLs are valid for a week, maybe up to 10 days, depending exactly on which compliance regime you're in. So if we can just get a new cert every week, we don't need revocation. We can obsolete it completely. So that's sort of one current thing that's ongoing. The baseline requirements, which is the sort of set of guidelines that the browsers and CAs have come up with together, recently basically recognize this and does not require revocation for anything under 10 days, though that's going to change to 7 days in the future. Microsoft's root program actually still requires OCSP, which means all CAs still have to do it, but it might change in the future. Now, short-lived certificates are actually sort of hard because you need automation. But unlike with this sort of death spiral of non-adoption that OCSP stapling has, you probably want automated certificate issuance anyways. And unlike OCSP stapling, where you actually had to make software changes to your web server or your TLS stack to support including this extra pinned response, anything that supports certs can support short-lived certs. You just have to like write a new file on disk and reload it. So there's also better uptime properties with automating your short-time certs, because unlike OCSP stapling, where you have to go to your CA to get the OCSP response, you can actually have multiple CAs with short certs, and you can just switch. Cloudflare, for example, always uses at least 2 CAs for all of the certs they issue to support redundancy in case one is down. Including the, to make that automation more accessible, CAs are also increasingly supporting the Acme protocol, which was designed by Let's Encrypt, to make sure that client software can be interoperable between CAs. So we get better security from not needing revocation. We get better uptime because we can switch CAs and not have manual steps that can lead to broken websites, and you can get better reliability. There's also this extra bonus, which is that if your certificates have shorter lifetimes, the data set of currently revoked certs shrinks, which makes things like CRL Lites or even classic CRLs work better. So even if we can't go to 7-day certs right now everywhere, pushing that lifetime down will also make this a lot more effective. There's some push to cap certs to 90 days, which will probably dramatically increase that. So that's sort of our set of options today. CRLs, they're too big and too slow to check on demand. OCSP has like bad privacy and big reliability issues. OCSP stapling is impossible to deploy. CRL sets in one CRL, they help, but they're an incomplete solution. CRLite is a working version of those. And short-lived certs, finally, obsolete revocation. So if you run a website, you're a business with a SaaS provider, you should automate your certs. I think that's everything I've got today. Thanks for letting me talk. If you want to find me online, you can find me on InfoSec Exchange, on Mastodon, or my own website. Does anyone have any questions?
You have a question in the middle there?
So the Acme protocol is a protocol that a piece of software running on a web server or other piece of automation can use to talk to a CA to request a certificate issuance. The traditional way of issuing certs was you log into a website, you like click some buttons, and then you download a cert, and then some engineer goes and uploads it to a, your web server. The idea of Acme is the automatic certificate management environment or something like that. Which is designed to allow software to request certificates themselves. If you've used Let's Encrypt, that's the protocol that Let's Encrypt uses to obtain certificates.
What do you think the impact of certificate issuance and commercial impact, like why the big CA making a lot of money would want to showcase?
I would hope that certificate authorities can recognize the security wins. One of the big things is that OCSP, which everyone has to run right now, is in many cases the biggest cost center in an ECA. I know at Let's Encrypt we have like 2 orders of magnitude more traffic for OCSP than anything else. We spend $1 million on database servers to power OCSP, right? That's a lot of money that could be doing other things. And Let's Encrypt is a nonprofit. We're supported by your donations and corporate grants and things. It really is potentially a big financial win on the the corporate side to get rid of OCSP. So short-lived certs. I mean, short-lived certs are still going to require more load to issue those certs over and over again. But the cost-benefit analysis really shows that short-lived certs to be a lot better. But the adoption problem there is that they do need to be automated, which a lot of CAs are now doing, but haven't always done.
Instead of explaining like SSL certificates used to be like getting certificate is a big deal. You pay a lot of money for or something. They check who you are,
yeah,
and guarantee to everyone. And it seems like with short-lived certificate, it's not practically possible. Like, so what's their
yeah. So the main thing that a certification authority is tasked with doing is validating that a site owner, has control of a domain name, and that the same entity, has that private key. This was in the past often done by hand, done by a room full of validation operators or something. I think one of the things that Let's Encrypt showed is that we can fully automate it through creation of software. That is really what has enabled this. First of all, it's what enabled Let's Encrypt to be free and to scale to issuing 3 million certs a day. We don't have 3 million people sitting in a room each checking a domain name. But that's sort of once the flow is automated, you can run it as fast and as often as you want. Yeah. I mean, they all need to automate. I mean, and then they sort of all have. I don't want to say that they're dying because there's still lots of value you can get out of having an entity that gives you business support and SLAs and all kinds of agreements like that. And you might want to pay for that. And that's that kind of business relationship is what has powered CAs in the past. So really, that's still going to exist. The fact that they're can optimize their own workflow doesn't mean that they're going to go away, but it does mean that entities like Let's Encrypt, who's doing it for free, can expand the pool of people who have certs. We one in the back. Oh, okay. Yeah, I could. Yeah, so extended validation was a mechanism. Let me see if I can find an example. Okay, I can't really see my own screen on the projector, so I'm not going to try. The idea, so one thing I sort of mentioned, what a CA does is they bind a domain name to a public key, and they sign it. Extended validation adds not just a domain name, but a business name, what country they operate in, the employer identification number in some database that I don't know what it is. And that might give you more confidence that the entity you're talking to, not just the web server, is who they claim they are. Now that's really beneficial to CAs because I can charge a lot of money for those. But there's been a number of research projects which show that it doesn't really work. There's no signal to users that it prevents phishing or otherwise sort of prevents any problems. It's really just an additional cost. There are some use cases where EV is still beneficial. For example, in code signing binaries on Windows, you sort of want to know that the binary came from the company you got it from. That's a different model than connecting to a TLS web server. So EV has sort of, there's maybe some indication in a web browser still. There's a little button you can click and it shows you the business info, but nobody ever clicks it, so it doesn't really do anything. And I don't think it provides a ton of value on the web. Note that doing EV is separate from the issuance flow. So if you do EV on your CA's backend, you can still use the Acme protocol to automatically get a new cert every week. That extended validation might still be good for a year, right? That's a business validation. It's different than the actual issuance flow. So there's actually a little bit of decoupling there that can happen. So short-lived certs are not in opposition or incompatible with EV.
Yeah, maybe just one more question, but in the green vest, yeah.
I'm just curious about revocation. My personal experience, I never experienced revocation in my browser, so I never get a pop-up saying.
What browser do you use?
Chrome.
Right. So Chrome basically doesn't do revocation. So yes, you won't experience it. Unless there's a major breach of google.com or something, in which case they can use their CRL sets mechanism to push it out. But yeah, otherwise, I mean, Chrome doesn't check OCSP or CRLs or anything. So
How often did I experience it by the transition?
Probably you wouldn't experience it too often. The main case where stuff gets revoked is if a cert has been sort of misissued in some way, or they've lost control of their keys. Usually then you also need the revoked cert to still be used on a web server or to be used by an attacker who's man in the middling you. So if there's no attacker who doesn't have a key, then you're not going to see a revoked cert. There was just a complete example. There was a news story a couple days ago that the German police intercepted some Jabber server and was man in the middling their connection. That cert was at some point expired, which is how they noticed. But if it had been revoked, that's a case where there was some entity in between that had a web server up. And if their cert had been revoked, you might have noticed it. In that case, they were using the Jabber protocol, which probably doesn't check revocation either. But there's really, not that many places that you'd actually run into this, except in the case of an actual attack using a revoked cert.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Matt. That was fantastic.